Okay, tonight's program, pot herbs, salads and roots, kitchen gardens in the early 19th century by Christy Higginbottom from Old Sturbridge Village, and we wanted to give her a nice rousing hand. Christy Higginbottom, garden historian, has worked as a costume interpreter at OSV since 1981. She coordinated the historic horticultural program, researching, planning, and planting the recreated kitchen and flower gardens at the museum's historic households. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just in case anybody didn't get a handout, I do have, maybe I can hand them back this way to you so people who didn't get one can get one. Okay. Okay, and I appreciate being invited back to Shrewsbury. It's always great to come here every couple of years and see you all again. So tonight we're going to be talking about kitchen gardens in the 19th century, and your handout includes this garden plan on it, which I think we'll be talking about quite a bit in a couple of minutes. It's a great plan from a circa 1850 gardening book. So I wanted to start with one of my favorite quotes, which I also gave to you, and it comes from Samuel Dean's New England Farmer, and the edition I took it out of was 1822, but this quote actually goes all the way back to the 1790s, and it often will ring familiar to people in the present day. It was written a long time ago. I consider the kitchen garden to be of considerable importance, as pot herbs, salads, and roots of various kinds are useful in housekeeping. Having a plenty of them at hand, a family will not be so likely to run into the error which is too common in this country of eating flesh in too great a proportion for health. Sound familiar? Farmers as well as others should have kitchen gardens, and they need not grudge the labor of tending them, for it may be done in odd intervals of time which might otherwise tend to be consumed with needless loitering. Again, the reasons that we're reading today in modern literature encouraging people to grow their own vegetables at home are to eat a healthier diet and to get good exercise. And this is nothing new. The people have been writing about this for a long time. So this is a kitchen garden at the Freeman Farmhouse.
My favorite house at Sturbridge.
I think it's probably a favorite of many, many people at the village. And it's a very typical kitchen garden with pot herbs, salads, and roots, plenty of them at hand, so that the family will not run into the error of eating flesh in too great a proportion for health. So the very harvest that comes from that garden then gets prepared indoors in the kitchen, following recipes from the early 1800s. And the tending of the garden is done as it was in the 19th century, a great deal of it by the women of the household. The garden was almost always located near at hand to the house, and that made it easy for women and children from the family to take those odd intervals of time and go out and tend the kitchen garden. So certainly the heavy-duty work of plowing it, building the fencing around it, hauling in manure to enrich the soil, those tasks were often done by the men and older boys of the household, but garden work was often a task done by the women and the children in the house. This is one of my favorite images because it's very hard to find actual early 19th century pictures that show you a landscape with a kitchen garden. There might be a lot of reasons for that, one being that the kitchen garden was a utilitarian garden. It was not usually regarded as decorative and ornamental, and so when house portraits were made, the portrait painter, like the painter of the person, would often focus on the most appealing aspects of the landscape, and a kitchen garden often doesn't show up. But here, in this portrait, this is a detail from a larger painting. The painting itself hangs in Roseland Cottage, what's often known as the Pink House, down there in Woodstock, Connecticut. So if you want to see the whole painting in its original, you can see it there. And this is a detail of Chandler Farm. And you can see in this detail this kitchen garden adjacent to the house. And it follows a lot. It's a pretty simple, basic kind of kitchen garden, not a really fancy one, but it follows a lot of the advice that we see in the 19th century For one thing, it is located near the house. As one writer said, lest being out of sight, it be out of mind and too little tended. It also has a ready supply of water, something that is important even to us today if we want to have a kitchen garden. What you will notice is 2 well sweeps, one right here and the second one right here, to draw water up from, you can see these wooden boxes that enclose the dug wells. And when you had dug wells, it often required several dug wells on a piece of property. I remember that was sort of an aha experience when I started working at the village. Having grown up in a house with an artesian well, I had a tendency to think of a house having a well. And then when you begin to research early property or explore an early piece of property, what you discover was that in order to provide all the water necessary and to put it where it was necessary so that you didn't have to spend a lot of time carrying water a great distance, you would find numerous wells on a single piece of property. And here we see 2. The other thing that is interesting in this image is this enclosure right here. The white blob that you see here is a sow with a litter of piglets. So this is a little pig sty located adjacent to the garden. Again, following advice to have a pig located near the garden was very practical. Any waste from the garden in the form of weeds or tops of vegetables and other such things could simply be thrown over the wall into the pig pen where the pig would consume it. And then you would have the waste from the pig manure in the sty that could just simply be thrown over the wall and back into the garden. And so today, advice is to locate your compost pile near your garden so you don't have to move the compost too far. And here you can see all of that advice being followed in this very typical kitchen garden. A kitchen garden was often fenced. And when people, this is yours truly talking in costume over the fence here, it was a few years ago. When people talk with me over the fence in the garden, they often ask me if the garden is fenced to keep out deer. And deer were not a problem at all in the early 19th century. So much of the land here in New England was cleared and open because of farming that the sight of a deer would have been something you would have told everybody about, as Henry David Thoreau did in his journals when he wrote that his neighbor told him that somebody he knew had seen a deer. It was an unusual experience. But it was not at all unusual to see sheep, cows, pigs, oftentimes out of their enclosures and wandering about. And so a fence around a garden was really an essential thing in order to control livestock and keep them from getting in your garden. And Samuel Dean notes that the fence should help to keep out weed seeds, because your garden today, people's gardens are often located adjacent to other people's mowed lawns, and we think we have weed problems. Think of what it was like when your garden was located adjacent to a hayfield or a cow pasture. A lot more weed seed to blow about, and that would be helpful. And, as Dean says, the fence should be at least 7 feet high and picketed on the top to prevent the entrance of thieves. And so there were all kinds of things you were fencing your garden for. A picketed or paled fence around a garden also would help to exclude chickens and other household fowls from scratching up in your garden. They can fly, but it's their habit when they fly to a fence to fly up and roost on the fence and then drop down to the other side. So if you picket your fence, they won't fly up and roost on it, and this will help to keep the chickens out of your garden too. So a fence was an important aspect. The other thing that was great about a fence, and this one here is a good example, you can see the sunlight shining right against this fence. That's because this fence is on the north side of the garden, and the sun is shining in from the south in this direction, striking that fence. And what it does is it warms the ground right in front of the fence in the spring. If you probably can see it right now on your own property, if you look around where there are south-facing walls, south-facing walls on the north, on the south side of those walls, your snow has melted because the wall itself warms up the environment in front of it. And so when you have a garden fence, you can actually use the area just inside it as a kind of nursery bed early in the season to get little plants started off as seedlings, which then can be transplanted into the larger garden once it's prepared and the soil has warmed up. So a fence served many, many functions around the kitchen garden. Many kitchen gardens were pretty simple, like the one not very decorative or not fancy in its layout like the ones we've looked at so far. But then there were other people who wanted a more formal kind of garden, a more decorative garden. And in fact, Peter Adam Schenck quotes an English garden writer, William Cobbett, to explain why having a decorative garden is actually a very good idea. He says, although in the business of laying out a garden, ornament is a mere secondary consideration, yet perfect regularity and neatness are attained with very little labor, and they will certainly add much to the gardener's interest in the spot. William Cobbett, the English gardener, said, "It is quite as reasonable for a man to take pleasure in a garden which is tastefully arranged and tidily kept, as it is for a woman to delight in a fine dress, and he will be as anxious to preserve the neat appearance of the beds and walks as she to protect her gown from dust or grease or from being faded by the sun or eaten by moths. We all take best care of that which is most pleasant to the eye." And so this is an argument in favor of making your kitchen garden a fashionable, a neat and orderly design. And the traditional design for a kitchen garden is what is known as the Foursquare Plan. And here Peter Schenck, in his gardener's textbook, shows you the basic design of the Foursquare kitchen garden. And here it is with its compass points noted. A diagram or plan of our garden may be deemed not out of place. It is in the shape of a parallelogram running east and west with the entrance on the south side. So here, this is where he places his entrance. He says the border inside the fence, and by that he means this area.
I have a question. Why is it not drawn to scale? You think south would be at the bottom, west would be on the left, east is at the top, and north is to the left.
Well, you've got to, what you need to do here is you need to turn your garden plan, if you always think of it in terms of the globe with north on the top and south on the bottom, just swing it around here. We'll be explaining in a couple minutes why it makes sense for it to work this way. And in fact, the plan that you have on, that I showed you earlier, that you have on your handout, we're going to talk about in just a minute, and I'll be able to give you a little better answer to your question then. So the border is about 8 feet wide in Schenck's garden plan, and the part that faces the south, this one is facing toward the south, toward the west and toward the east, is adapted for plants that require a warm exposure. And the other, the side that faces north, that would be this side, it faces the north, is for such as need shelter from the midday sun. And again, I'll show you some examples of that in just a second. In the center of the garden is the tool house, directly beneath which is a good location for a cistern. So this is a very practical garden design that Schenck is presenting. Not everybody followed this direction, but the Foursquare Plan was very common. The quarters, meaning each of these rectangles, are of equal size so that a 4-year rotation of crops may be readily observed. So here's the plan that's on the handout that I gave you. And if you look at Thomas Bridgman's plan, his is swung around now. So this right down here is south. That may make you more comfortable. Here's south, here's north, here in this plan. So if you didn't know, if I hadn't told you that this was south and this was north, can you find any clues from what you know about gardening that might, and from what I've already told you, that might suggest that this is the north side and this is the south? I heard somebody say one. Hotbeds and seed beds, right. So again, On the north side of the garden, the sun is going to be shining into your garden from this direction and striking a fence, or in this case, I think he represents a hedge. This side of the garden is going to warm up faster than this side of the garden does. So this side of the garden is a great place to locate a hotbed. We're going to talk about those in a little bit. Seed beds, places where you're going to plant seeds early as a kind of nursery to get plants started, and early crops, things that you want to get started early in the garden, can go up here. Now, again, if you're a gardener paying attention at this plan, you might notice some other aspects of it. We mentioned that a Foursquare kitchen garden makes it possible for a rotation of plants. And the reason it makes it easy to rotate plants is that what you can do, if you're going to practice crop rotation, the reason you're going to do that is, actually there are several reasons. Plants take from the soil nutrients, and plants that are related to one another in the same plant family have similar tastes. I often will say to people, it's sort of like going to a buffet where one end of the table has Chinese food and the middle of the table might have Mexican food and the other end might have some maybe some Italian food, and then you might have the traditional old New England dishes somewhere, and you'll get certain groups of people that will tend to eat from certain parts of that table. Vegetables are like that. Where they grow, they take from the soil their favorite nutrients. If you keep putting the same vegetable back into the same soil year after year, like if the Italians keep going to the same place on the buffet table over and over, pretty soon there's not going to be anything they like there. And the same thing happens in a garden. So if we move crops around in the garden year to year, when they move, there's a better chance that they're going to be able to find in the new soil nutrients that they are looking for, and they won't exhaust those nutrients in the soil where they were growing. The other thing that happens is that there are a number of diseases that plants get that can be carried over from one year to the next in the soil, soil-borne diseases. If we grow those plants in the same soil from year to year to year, those disease organisms can actually build up in that area of soil and make it much more likely that the plants are going to suffer diseases in the coming years. By moving them around, we can help to break up that pattern of disease and insects as well. So if you look at this garden plan, you will notice that there is one whole quarter of this garden devoted to a group of plants that are all very closely related. It's right here. Cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, and kale are all brassicas. And they are one of the groups of plants that is the most important to move from time to time, because they are very susceptible to a soil-borne disease called clubroot that will make their roots develop kind of swollen areas that will interrupt the circulation in the plant. They also share the same appetite for certain nutrients in the soil. By putting them all together here, what that means is that next year when we get ready to plant the garden, we could put them all over here and keep moving them around. With this garden is designed for a 3-year rotation of plants, not a 4-year. We have 4 squares, but can anyone figure out why we only have a 3-year rotation?
Asparagus and strawberries.
Right on. Right over here, this whole quarter of the garden is devoted to perennials, perennial plants that are going to be staying in that part of the garden from year to year. And here's where I usually can find somebody who knows what Pye Plant is. Oh, we haven't got any folks who know Pye Plant. Pye Plant is an old name for rhubarb. Rhubarb. Yeah, rhubarb. It's called Pye Plant, of course, because one of the favorite things to do with it is to make pie. It was also sometimes called spring fruit, even though the part of it that you eat is not a fruit, it's a leaf stem, but it would give you in the spring the closest thing to a fruit, which you might have to wait for much later in the 19th century than we would today. Sea kale is related to the cabbages, but it's a perennial. It comes back year after year after year. So we have asparagus, rhubarb, sea kale, and strawberries, and it's sensible to put them all in 1/4 of the Foursquare garden, because that way we've got 3 other quarters in which to rotate crops. You might notice a couple of other things here. Lettuce, which in the summertime likes a little bit of shade, doesn't like to grow in the heat, is growing on this border where it will receive a little shade from the fence here because the sun shines in this way. You'll see over here, and we'll talk about it later, a tomato trellis. Here we have beans and peas and sweet corn growing together. That's a very old combination of crops. Actually, the Native Americans combined beans and sweet corn. Peas, of course, are a crop that the Native Americans did not have. But peas and beans are both legumes. And their big advantage is that they don't take as much out of the soil as they give to the soil. What peas and beans can do is they can actually extract nitrogen, one of the most important soil nutrients. They can take nitrogen out of the air because they team up with some beneficial bacteria that live in the soil that enable them to take nitrogen out of the air and then fix it on their roots. So they are legumes, and what legumes do is they actually enrich the soil. They're fertilizing the garden as they grow. Now, corn is a crop that uses a huge amount of nitrogen. So by pairing them up in the same area, the legumes help to provide some extra nitrogen, making up for what the corn takes out. Yeah, question?
Pumpkins and squash, we know that to be something the early settlers used. Where are they in this plant? Or
They're
are they
not.
out of
They're going to be grown as a field crop. And they might appear in a kitchen garden. That's a good observation. They might be in a kitchen garden. In a kitchen garden like this, you're more likely to find crops that don't have that long vining habit. And so they are going to probably be growing, in fact, they might be growing in a field corn. They were often grown under field corn because they would spread out and grow underneath the corn. That's, again, a Native American crop pairing. The 3 sisters were the corn, the beans, and the squash. But yes, people certainly did grow them. So they're going to be somewhere, but just not, they're not as...
If you had a farm, they're out in the field. If you were just having your own little...
If you had a
garden,
large
what
1/4 of an acre garden like the ones that I showed you a few minutes ago, you'd have room for some of those in there. Pumpkins almost always were field crop grown with corn. The bush types of squashes were a little more bushy then than they are for us today. Our varieties of squash, like summer squashes, have been bred to take up even less space than they once did, but they don't vine. They could fit into a situation like this more easily. Right, so we've got some early potatoes. A lot of potatoes would have been grown as field crops as well, because the ones that you were going to store for wintertime, you'd need a lot of. And so those were often grown out in a separate field just for potatoes. Any other questions about?
Yes, I have a question.
Yep.
This is all very scientific in and out. Was this a trial and error that these people learned where to put these plants up? How did they innately understand that you put all the cabbage in one spot, or was it trial and error?
Actually, in that Peter Schenck garden design that I showed you just a little bit ago, one of the quotes that's in the book with his design quotes Virgil and on the rotation of crops. So the understanding of the need to rotate crops goes way, way back. It's been common knowledge for a long time. As we learn more scientifically about plants, what we learn is some of the more in-depth scientific explanation for why rotations work. But as far as understanding that it's a good idea, that goes back a long ways. And the 19th century understood the disease and the nutrition part of that. And we've, in fact, within my gardening experience, I've read books that come up with new reasons explaining it. It didn't take very many gardeners very long to realize, just by observation, that if you kept the thing growing in the same spot, it was going to decline in its health. And so then the question became why, but they knew the answers by this time.
Told me.
Right, Yes, and that's how the average person, I'm quoting from some garden advice books, and certainly there were people who owned some of these books and they could read these explanations. But how to garden, you learned that because you gardened with your parent and they explained why you were doing these various things. So it was very common. This is again back to the Freeman Farm kitchen garden, which isn't a Foursquare garden, it's a more traditional 1/4 of an acre garden. One of the tricky things about the fancy Foursquare garden is that to turn the soil in this garden, even if it's a relatively large garden, you're going to have to do that with hand tools. You can't bring an ox team in and expect them to plow in these little areas when you've got these permanent paths in there. And so for the average farm garden, it's often not one of these highly organized gardens with set paths. It's more like what you see here at the Freeman Farm. And so this garden would get plowed fall and spring, usually if you were a careful gardener. And then the common way to lay out a kitchen garden was in what were called beds. So here we have a bed of carrots, we have a bed of beets here, another bed of beets here, and a bed of turnips over here. Beds in the garden are typically about 3 to 4 feet wide. This garden, the Freeman Farm garden, is 50 feet from one end to the other. So this is a 50-foot long bed that's 3 to 4 feet wide. And then rows would be planted in those beds. And by doing it this way, the gardener then never walks in this area in the bed. The gardener walks in the area that's maybe 18 inches or so wide, just wide enough to admit your feet to move up and down so you're not wasting space. And then you reach into the center of the bed. That's why you don't want it to be much wider than 4 feet, because you want it to be narrow enough that you can reach into it easily from either side. What that means is that the rows of vegetables here can be a little more closely spaced than they would be if you were expecting to walk up and down between each row. And when the garden is, as you see it here, in its midsummer growth, what it means is that now the foliage on the crop plants shades the garden, helps to hold in moisture, and it reduces the weeds. It doesn't eliminate them completely, but it cuts them down considerably. And so the gardener then stands at the edge of the bed and works into the bed, as you see this woman doing who's weeding her onions. Here is the parsonage garden, which is the more formal style of garden. It's not exactly the Foursquare kitchen plan, but it's very similar in that it has these large beds, large rectangles broken up into beds. You can see here each of the beds with the alleys in between and crops being planted in those. And then the garden has permanent paths, wide enough to admit you to roll a wheelbarrow up and down in them. So you need a few paths that are big enough to allow you to move your wheelbarrow around, while paths between beds only need to be big enough for you to move up and down to work on them. And those permanent paths, it was recommended that they be topped with what the 19th century referred to as gravel. Now, gravel to the 19th century gardener and gravel to us today don't necessarily conjure up the same thing. Today, if you say gravel to somebody, they're probably going to imagine something like pea stone. If you've ever tried to roll a wheelbarrow, a loaded wheelbarrow, over a path of pea stone, you know it's really hard to do. What you want in a garden is you want a path that will pack but will drain. And so the gravel they were talking about was the kind of sand that you could collect at the edge of a pond or a stream where there might be a few stones mixed in with it, but it's mostly a sand. It was laid in the paths, and then it was in a fancy, really well-made garden, it was laid so that it was slightly higher in the center of the path and then rolled with a garden roller to firm it and pack it. And that would make it well-drained, firm and hard, and easy to walk on. So how would you create these beds? Well, I've brought a couple of garden tools with me to show you. These are 2 tools that are being used in the image that you see here to create the beds. So the first thing we're going to do in the bed area is, with a spade, we're going to turn the soil and incorporate into it the broken down manure that we're going to use to enrich the soil. So that gets turned in. By doing that, what we end up with is a bed that's just slightly raised up higher than the alley, just because the soil's looser and because we've added the composted manure to it. And then to make our rows for sowing seeds, what we want to do is we want to make a nice straight line. That's particularly important when you're dealing with a bed like the one at the Freeman Farm that's 50 feet long. If you just try and eyeball 4 rows of carrots, you can end up with wasting a lot of space. So one of the important tools is a garden reel. And this is the garden reel. So you put the end with the wound twine in the ground at the end, one end of your row, and then you walk down the garden pulling this out and unwinding it and set this at the other end, and that marks your straight line. And then to draw the groove that you're going to put your seed in is what's known as a drill. To draw the drill, what you want is a dibble or dibber, and you could buy dibbles. Garden tool supply folks made these, but why would you buy one when somewhere in the course of your garden history it's very likely you may have broken the handle of a shovel or of a spading fork, and that easily then just gets pointed and turned into your dibble, and then you just draw that along the line that you've made with your string to make your drill, and then you move it on. The other tool that's really useful here is this one. This is what's known as a garden rule. A garden rule was typically about 7 or 8 feet long, and it was just essentially a big ruler marked out in 1 foot lengths with the bottom foot or 2 feet in inches, so that you can then use that to space out your crops to the proper distance and mark out your rows on your beds. So this is how you would set up the beds for planting in your garden. And as I mentioned, garden advice books existed. In fact, advice books of all kinds are starting to be really common in the 19th century, with the costs of printing and paper making going down. A lot more publishing is happening. And so what I've learned about historic gardening came out of the library at Old Sturbridge Village, where we have a marvelous collection of these historic garden books. And if you think you would enjoy reading historic garden books but don't feel like you have easy access to them, if you do anything on the computer, I would encourage you to investigate a website, couple of websites, one of them in particular called Biodiversity Heritage Library. This website has taken digitized, scanned copies of historic garden books and other books and put them online, so that almost any of these really neat, whoops, didn't mean to go quite that fast. Almost any, oh, I might, I've just got to go back to my slideshow.
I've done this before.
I must have hit one of those buttons you told me not to hit. Just slideshow from current slide. From current slide. There, okay. So what I've learned has come from these historic gardening books and catalogs and such. So I'm going to be talking with you a little bit more about the kitchen garden and using some of those sources. Thank you for your help. And one of them includes Robert Bust's book, The Family Kitchen Gardener. And we imagine at Old Sturbridge Village that many of our gardeners were learning how to garden from their parents and didn't have a library of books at home. But our minister, shown here, oh, why am I getting that? Our minister, shown right here, is teaching his child how to garden, but he's also teaching him by using an advice book that he has purchased. And seed catalogs give us a huge amount of information. By the 1830s, the New England Farmer Seed Store was doing big business down in Boston. And it was located at what we today know of as Quincy Market. In the North Market building of Quincy Market was the New England Farmer Seed Store. And you could go there to buy seeds of various kinds, but they also published a catalog, and you could order seeds just like you do today through the mail in the 1830s. The seed catalog lists numerous different varieties of common vegetables that are available. You might notice we can often tell or at least get a hint of what various vegetables were the most popular just by the number of different varieties that there were. So we know from this list and also from other sources that cabbage was an extremely popular vegetable in the 19th century. We've got early cabbages, mid-season cabbages, late cabbages, all kinds of cabbages. We have numerous varieties of carrots, for example, and beets, the roots that I'm going to be talking about. The seed catalog, like any good seed catalog, if the seedsman gives you good directions on how to grow your plants, and if you follow those directions and you are successful, then you are more likely to return to that seedsman and buy more of his seeds. So it's good business for the seedsman then as now to give you really complete directions to make sure you can do a good job of growing your garden. And so in the 19th century catalog, we also have this information for each of these different varieties that you see here. And on this particular page, we've got not only our common vegetable, the cucumber. We also have, we're going to be talking about pot herbs, salads, and roots. So we have some salads in here. We have some pot herbs. I guess we don't actually have a root in that one, but we certainly did in the previous one. And as I've given you on your handout a copy of this, Joseph Breck & Company's seed catalog in Boston, 1836, includes the option, if you wanted to buy individual packets from that list, it's very typical to pay 6 cents for a paper of seed. Almost anywhere that you see them advertised, that's a classic seed paper price. But Breck says he has put together a box for the convenience of customers with an assortment of kitchen garden vegetable seeds. And he says each box contains a package of the following seeds. So he has separated out into a box probably a collection of seeds that he has seen in big demand by his customers. If he wants to sell these boxes, it would make sense for him to put in there the most popular kinds of vegetables that people are going to order. If you look at this from a 21st century perspective, you may notice that something that would be very important to you and your neighbors and family is not on that list. Tomato. No tomatoes in there. It doesn't mean that Joseph Breck doesn't have tomatoes in his catalog. He does. And we're going to look a little later to see where the tomato appears. But in 1836, it does not rank right up there on the top of the most common popular vegetables. And so it doesn't happen to be included here. And we can get a sense for popular herbs. Parsley is included right up in the vegetable list, the double-curled parsley. The 3 pot herb varieties, sweet marjoram, sage, and summer savory. Of those, I'm guessing probably sage is the one that is the most familiar to you all in terms of using it in your kitchens. Summer savory and sweet marjoram were very familiar to people in the past. They have gone out of popularity a bit today. They shouldn't have, but they have. And so I'm going to start by taking a look at pot herbs. We said the garden should have pot herbs, salads, and roots in it. And here's the frontispiece from Esther Allen Howland. Her father was a printer in Worcester, Massachusetts. She's the lady who's responsible for introducing the Valentine. You may have heard about that. And she wrote books on cookery and housekeeping, and that's the frontispiece from her book. And Lydia Maria Child is another Massachusetts woman writer who became quite famous and well-known. And her book, The American Frugal Housewife, includes a lot of recipes, including one for fricasseed chicken, where she recommends that you put herbs, sweet herbs, and she mentions marjoram or sage, according to your taste, into her recipe. And so these are the 2 of the really common herbs that we were just mentioning here. The sweet marjoram, which is actually a perennial herb, but it's tender. So in New England, we have to grow it as an annual or bring a pot indoors. And sage, of course, which is a very hardy perennial herb. We can get it in the garden and then we can have it for years in the garden. These were very common herbs. Sage, particularly with poultry, we have an interesting recipe at Old Sturbridge Village for a very easy stuffing for chickens, where you just take slices of bread, butter them, cover them with sage, and then stuff them into the cavity of the chicken. So it's a very easy way to stuff a chicken. And parsley, as I mentioned, parsley is very familiar to us. We're probably all pretty familiar with the fancy curly type and the plain parsley, which even in the 19th century was recognized as having the most robust flavor. But how many of you know Hamburg parsley? Hamburg parsley is a root parsley. It was grown for its root, which looks like a small parsnip, and it was used as a flavoring. So you could take the root and chop it up, and it worked really well in slow cooked dishes like soups and stews, because you could cook it slowly for a long time and it wouldn't lose its flavor the way the parsley leaf would if you cooked it for a long time and didn't just add it at the end of the cooking. So Hamburg parsley. And this is just a selection of some of the traditional culinary herbs that you would see in a seed catalog from the time period. And these are herbs that might get used fresh, as you see the woman cooking up some fresh vegetables here in the kitchen. But they also got dried, and when they were dried, then they would be pounded in a mortar and pestle, and they might be stored whole dried. In fact, some writers very wisely advised their cooks to do that, because once they're pounded, broken up, they begin to lose their essences faster. And then they might be pounded, as you see the young woman doing here, just before it's time to use them. But these are some of the most common ones. And we see them listed here in Barrett's Boston New England Farmer Seed Store catalog. Pot and sweet herbs up here on the left. Garlic actually was not very common in New England at all. The English had a bias against it because of what it did to your breath when you ate it. One English writer said it was eaten by Frenchmen, as the English are apt to ascribe all kinds of bad habits to the French. Said eaten by Frenchmen to a degree that would drive you from the table. So it was a little slow to get adopted here in New England. But these are, I'm doing it again. These are some of the common pot and sweet herbs over here for cooking, but also medicinal herb seeds would be sold, and you would add medicinal herbs into the selection of herbs that you would grow. You'll notice in that Bridgman garden plan that I looked at earlier that you have on your handout that there's a bed devoted to herbs in that plan. And it also, you might notice that in the medicinal herb seeds, you may notice some things that people usually think of as more cooking, things like dill, for example. And we'll talk in a few minutes about how some of those herbs can be regarded as medicinal. They can be regarded as medicinal because when you combine them with certain foods, you can prevent certain digestive upsets. And this is a wonderful English cartoon. I think anybody who's ever had a stomach ache can probably relate to this woman who is suffering from the colic. And we want to prevent that. And certain foods can tend to cause the colic. In fact, certain foods are known to cause what was called the windy colic, which we probably talked about when I was here and presented my program on the family nurse. And so if we combine herbs with some of those foods, we can help to prevent these digestive upsets. So when we put pot herbs like savory, here we've got both the winter perennial savory and the annual summer savory. If we use them with beans, when we cook the beans, we can prevent the windy colic, which beans are apt to cause. We can also do that by not only using these herbs like fennel, coriander, and caraway are all herbs that promote digestion and prevent indigestion, by dipping the seeds of these into sugar and then passing them at the end of a meal. And of course, if today, what do you get at the end of a meal when you go out to a restaurant? A mint. Mint at the end of a meal will calm nausea at the stomach. It's no accident that it comes with your check. The restaurant wants to make sure that when you go away, you don't feel sick. And so they give you a little bit of mint. If you go to certain Indian restaurants, you might get coriander seed in a little dish. I've had that from time to time in an Indian restaurant. And in fact, what it does, it not only tastes good, but what it does is it calms the stomach and aids the digestion. And here's our mint, both spearmint and peppermint, very common herbs in a kitchen garden. Mint is stomachic and antispasmodic. It prevents cramping of the stomach and is useful in flatulencies. These qualities probably led, independently of its agreeable flavor, to its universal use in pea soup, in which it is a valuable ingredient. If you go to England to this day and order pea soup, it will come with spearmint in it. So this is an old English tradition, and it was designed to help the digestion. An herb, I had to throw this one in because it has become such a popular plant these days with all the interest in craft brewing, but hops was used and grown commonly in a garden as a medicinal herb. In fact, a fermented decoction made by simmering hops in water, known by the name of hop beer, and usually formed from this article, the hops tea, with the simple addition of treacle, a kind of molasses-like sweetener, is much used in the New England states. When made sufficiently bitter with the hops and taken as a common drink at meals, it promotes the digestion more than any of the table liquors in common use.
Wouldn't that take issue with the temperance movement?
It certainly could. In the 1830s, there was a temperance movement, and people looked at temperance. I'll just do this briefly. I don't want to hold us up too long, but it's a good question. The temperance movement could mean different things to different people. Some people claimed to be temperate if they simply avoided distilled beverages, like rum, for example. They thought intemperance was to indulge in ardent spirits, that was distilled liquor. They felt that fermented beverages, fermented to preserve them, like certain beers and cider and those kinds of things, were perfectly fine. Others said that you could not call yourself temperate if you drank anything alcoholic at all. And so they would say any fermented beverage could not be drunk if you wish to be a temperate person. And then there were people who went one step further than that. They said that if you drank anything stimulating, you could not claim to be temperate. And so you had to swear off coffee and tea in addition to alcoholic beverages. So it has many meanings to different people. It reduced the fermented beverage consumption, but did not eliminate it entirely.
Hops itself is not would make you drunk.
That's right. It had to be made into a fermented beverage. And here they're talking about a hop beer, which would be fermented in order to preserve it, but you could certainly drink a hops tea, and that would, unless you were into the extreme temperance, that would be okay. So we're going to take a quick look at some of the vegetables. I like to use this portrait here. This is Bert the Beet. We were working at the Freeman Farm at Old Sturbridge Village, and we harvested a beet one day that had this fabulous nose. And so using some cranberry beans for eyes and a little rye straw, the costume department gave us a shirt collar and a necktie for him, and he became Bert the Beet. So he kind of stands for the ancestors of all our modern vegetables. So we mentioned salads, and the spelling with two L's is the way that Samuel Dean spells it in that original source. And among the salads that are mentioned commonly in seed catalogs are some that might not be as familiar to you as some of the things that you might use in your salad today. Corn salad, cresses, endive or endive, and certain types of lettuce. This is an heirloom variety of lettuce called Silesian lettuce that shows up in the early catalogs. So these were the salads. They were eaten uncooked, but lettuces were also cooked. So you might have lettuce coming to the table either way. Just like we sometimes eat spinach raw and sometimes eat it cooked, there were some people who didn't want salads at all. They believed that you had to cook vegetables in order to make them digestible. And so a lot of people would never eat a cucumber raw, for example. They would only eat it if it had been cooked. Roots are the other one that we mentioned, pot herbs, salads, and roots. And root vegetables were a real mainstay. One of the problems with salads, of course, is that you really can only have them during the growing season. There was no way to preserve things like lettuces and cresses, so you only had them in fresh season. Whereas the things that were going to take up most of the room in your kitchen garden are going to be things you can eat both fresh, but that you can also store because you're growing in a kitchen garden all your family's vegetables that they're going to eat for the entire year, not just, as so many gardeners do today, vegetables that people are going to eat when the garden is in its productive season. And so root vegetables have the advantage that they can be preserved in boxes of sand in your cellar. And the reason this works is because these root vegetables, like carrots, beets, turnips, parsnips, are biennial plants. We rarely think of this. When we put a carrot seed in the ground, all we're thinking about is getting a carrot root. And the first season that that plant grows from seed, it makes that root and a bunch of leaves. What it does not make that season is any flowers or seeds. It makes this large root because it is going to have to stay alive from its first season, go into a dormant condition during the winter when there's not enough daylight or warmth to grow, and then resume growth the following spring and finish its life that second summer by flowering and going to seed. So when we grow root vegetables, we take advantage of that vegetable's life cycle because we can dig it out of the ground in the garden, bring it into a convenient location in the cellar, put it into bins of sand so it's dormant and asleep and it just feels fine in there as if it was right in the soil, and it will not die. It will stay alive all winter, just being dormant and waiting until its second year. And this is why root vegetables were such an important crop, because they will keep really well, and that's because they are biennials, programmed to live for 2 growing seasons. Some of them are familiar, like carrots. Others, like salsify or vegetable oyster, may not be so familiar to folks today. It's a carrot-like vegetable which looks a little bit like a small parsnip. It was called vegetable oyster because people believed that when it was cooked, it had the flavor of shellfish. Some people agree, other people can't taste shellfish in it at all. It's a very personal kind of thing. But a common way to prepare salsify was to cook it and mash it and then blend it together with some eggs and some butter and possibly some breadcrumbs and make it into, or flour, and make it into little cakes and fry them up like fish cakes. And it is like parsnips, a vegetable that is so tough and hardy that if you want, you can leave some of them right in the ground in your garden and just wait until the snow melts off at this time of the year and dig them out and eat them. And the flavor will be superior then, because as the plant gets ready to leaf out and make its second year of growth, it changes stored starches in the root to sugars, the energy it will need to do that growth. And so the flavor will sweeten and become better if it's dug at this time of the year. As I mentioned, cabbages were very, very common vegetables in the 19th century, and they came in all different shapes and sizes. The huge late flat Dutch cabbage, which can produce a head of cabbage that can weigh easily 15 to 20 pounds. The early Jersey Wakefield cabbage is sort of pointed-headed cabbage, which matures early, so it would give you fresh-eating cabbages during the summer. The Winnigstadt cabbage that was really pointy, and it makes a really large cabbage. So lots of variations in cabbage types and shapes. And cabbage, the bigger ones, like the flat Dutch cabbage, they mature in the fall. And again, the cabbage is a biennial. If you think about it, when was the last time you saw any flowers on your cabbage? It just produces this big, huge head of leaves. In order to have more cabbage, obviously at some point it's got to make flowers and seeds, or we wouldn't have any more cabbage. We don't tend to think of that because once we get what we want, we figure it's all over. So the cabbage will also store indoors. We leave the roots on it because we don't want to kill it by beheading it, and we hang it upside down in the cool, dark cellar where it will stay dormant. The outermost leaves of the cabbage may get crisped and dry and need to be peeled away to reveal the good, head of cabbage inside. But if you've grown one that weighs 20 pounds, the loss of 3 or 4 layers of leaves on the outside is nothing when it comes time to eat it. Onions are another biennial crop, and they will cure and store, like the white Portugal you see here, braided into ropes of onions. What we do is we pull them when they're dormant. We know they're dormant when the leaves growing upright on the onion drop over. That means the onion is going to sleep. It is stopping its growth from its leaves and making its bulb. The bulb likes to store in dry conditions. It's not like the carrot root that needs to stay moist in the bin of sand. It has a skin on the outside, and just as we don't store onions in the refrigerator, in the hydrator drawer, the way we do carrots or beets, we store them in a net bag to keep them dry. So historically, onions were braided with string into ropes and then hung up in places where they weren't likely to freeze, and then harvested or then eaten by just cutting away what you needed from a rope when it was time to eat it. Pumpkins and squashes will store really well, the winter ones, if they've been ripened properly on the plant until the skin is tough and hard. You can store them in a dry place in the house. We have accounts talking about pumpkins and squashes being stored under people's beds. You have to be careful because they will freeze, and bedrooms could easily go below freezing. So you might need to move them to a warmer spot, maybe to a kitchen where when the fire is put out at night, the warmth of the bricks keep the kitchen warm enough that your squashes won't freeze in there.
Or in my case, fieldstones. I have 2 fieldstone fireplaces and a white painted brick fireplace at my house.
So that's where you'd want to store your cabbage overnight if your house goes below freezing. But you can also do what these women are doing. You can cut them up. So if we have a pumpkin or a squash that's bruised and isn't going to keep well, we cut out the bruised place, peel it and cut it into chunks, and then string them like you would drying apples. String them up and hang them to dry. That will remove the moisture from the pumpkin, and then we don't need to worry about it freezing, and it's not going to spoil. When you want to use it, let's say you want to make a pumpkin pie next July, you just take a bag of that dried pumpkin, soak it to reconstitute it, and then proceed with your pumpkin pie recipe to make a pumpkin pie. And it will be rich in flavor because the flavor will be really concentrated in it. Melons, the citron melon, most melons, of course, are not things that you can preserve easily. They could be candied. The citron melon was a really good example of one that was being cultivated just for preserves. It's called the citron melon because the whole inside of this melon looks like the area just inside the skin of a watermelon, where it's green and firm. If you've ever made candied watermelon, you know that you just use that firm green part just inside the skin. Well, if you like that, you could grow the, whoops, wrong one again. You could grow the citron melon. And this one is not a melon you would slice up to eat out of hand because, as I said, the whole inside of it is that firm green flesh. But it was used to cut up and then to candy to make a substitute for candied citron that you could put into cakes and such when you baked them. There were lots of different kinds of melons, and many of them were very short season melons. They would ripen in 90 days or just a little more, so that you could actually grow them from seed planted in the ground in a New England garden and expect to get ripe melons. And a lot of those melon varieties disappeared when melons started being shipped from the Carolinas, and people up here in New England stopped growing their own melons and started buying melons at the store. Then the growers didn't need those seeds with the short season melons, and the seed companies stopped carrying them. So some of those heirloom melons are hard to find these days. The ones that are easier to find are the ones that grow well in the South. We have trouble growing them up here. The pineapple melon was so called because it tastes and smells a lot like fresh pineapple.
You still get those seeds in Sturbridge Village?
Yes,
Like to buy 'em.
and I'm glad you asked me because I brought with me some information about Old Sturbridge Village. I'll mention it now. On the first weekend in April, they're doing a garden symposium. I'm going to be one of the presenters at that, and it's on saving your own seeds. It's teaching people how to save their own seeds so they could maintain their own heirloom varieties. But the village also sells seeds of heirloom varieties in their gift shop. So it's a good selection there. And I brought with me, for those of you who are gardeners, I brought a couple copies of a list that I've compiled of a number of seed companies that specialize in heirloom varieties. So I have that here if you're a gardener. And I have information here about the village's symposium, the seed saving symposium. And also, if you buy heirloom varieties of seeds at Old Sturbridge Village, we like to encourage you to come and exhibit your antique vegetables at our fair, which we hold every year in the fall. A great group of home gardeners who grow antique varieties of vegetables and flowers and herbs too, and bring them in to display. And if you think you'd like to join that group, it's a lot of fun. I have the information about that here for you as well. So thanks. I might have forgotten if I didn't get a reminder. Beans, of course, as I mentioned earlier, very common crop. A lot of these were of New World origin, but they had been taken to Europe even before the Pilgrims came over here. Two varieties that are of New World origin are the White Dutch Runner and case knife beans. These are pole varieties, and they were grown. You may have noticed in some of those earlier images, that image of the garden in Connecticut, that there were bean poles pictured in that image. So we need to be able to support these plants. So you would see in a kitchen garden bean poles. They might be teepeed like this, or they might be just set good and deep and sturdy and grown straight. And peas. They were very, very popular. This is New England, and the English loved their peas, and so they brought a wide variety of different peas over to this country. The catalogs, an individual catalog might offer seeds of 12 to 15 different kinds of peas, growing from 18 inches tall to 5 or 6 feet tall. The alderman pea is a pea that's going to grow really tall. To support these peas, we use the traditional English method of pea brush. So during the winter months, you might go out with a horse and sled or an ox and sled, and you might cut brush. Alders along a swamp were a very popular thing to cut for pea brush, because the alder shrub is a shrub that will coppice. So if you cut it down, it will send up new shoots and grow more. So you could just keep going to your swamp and harvesting your pea brush every winter, and it's a very twiggy kind of branch. So then that would be set firmly in the ground, and the pea seeds planted at the base of it, so that then the peas would grow up. Peas climb with tendrils. They don't climb by twining the way beans do. And so peas need a network to climb on, and providing them with brush provides them with the very kind of structure that they evolved climbing on. And that makes protecting them and harvesting them easy.
My question is, where can you get that pea brush? Because I'm sure now it's protected. If I were to go out to a swamp and I were to take a machete and do that,
right, if it's not your swamp.
The environmental police, I know, because I go by them on my way home from work. They're on.
Right. Well, it's.
Westboro.
I guess today it's not as easy to get pea brush. If you have any kind of plants on your home ground that you do any pruning of during the winter months, certainly you can save branches from those. Or if you know someone who's doing any logging or pruning, it's not as easy today. So a lot of modern people buy netting of some kind to use for their peas today. But this was your traditional method.
That's how I would want to do it, but it's just so hard to get these days.
Yep, I can understand that. And now we're going to come to the tomato, and it does show up. Here's our two images from Fearing Burr's 1865 Field and Garden Vegetables of America. Burr was a New England writer. His book was published in Boston. And he's showing you two ways, speaking of plant support, two ways to support the tomato plant. And the one on the left, this is made out of wooden stakes and the kind of hoops you would use for a barrel, that a cooper would use for a barrel. Today, of course, we buy metal hoops that look pretty much like the image that you see right here. A less familiar style of tomato training, but one that is still very useful that I've used in my home garden is trellis. And if you recall that one of those garden plans had a tomato trellis. And what it calls for is, this would be purchased lumber, lath boards and stakes, with the lath boards nailed or tied to the stakes at about 12 to 18-inch intervals and run horizontally to make a trellis. And then you grow your tomato plant up on that, tying it wherever it needs to be held to the support, almost like espaliering a fruit tree. And this makes a great system of tomato support. The tomato, here I mentioned earlier that even though Breck didn't offer the tomato in his box of seeds, it does show up in the seed list. But what you'll notice is where we've got, some dozen or so varieties of turnips, a common vegetable, you've just got tomato. Today, if you opened up a modern catalog, you'd find the tomato is the one that has all the hundreds and hundreds of named varieties, but it wasn't always that way. So it's just coming in, and the catalogs offer you some information in case you're not familiar with the tomato. They want to help you know not only how to grow it, but what you should do with it. And so the writer says it's used in soups and sauces, to which it imparts an agreeable acid flavor. It is also stewed and dressed in various ways and considered a very wholesome vegetable. But one of the things that will discourage you is the fact that it takes 6 to 8 weeks of growing time in a protected spot before you can put it out into the weather in order to get some ripe tomatoes before the frost kills it in the fall. And that is going to require the use of a hotbed. As the writer says here, it should be sown in a warm border in May or in hotbeds in March and transplanted about the 1st of June. Just exactly the advice we would be receiving today for growing tomatoes. But if you think about that, and if you think about the way most people grew most of their vegetables, they walked out into the ground when it was time and put the seed directly into the soil. To tell them that a vegetable they may have never eaten and might only have tasted a few times required all this amount of care to grow it was one of the main reasons why it took so long for it to become popular. Yes, as you've probably heard, some people thought they were unhealthy and not good for you, but that's right. But that is actually not the principal thing that kept people from growing it. It was a lack of familiarity with it and the difficulty that was involved with growing it. But it began to come into its own. So here we grow them in the minister's garden. He's our progressive gardener at Old Sturbridge Village. And so he has a tomato trellis here. And he's growing a variety, a very old variety called, very simply, the large red tomato. So one of the other features, if you're going to be growing tomatoes, and if you want to forward, if you want to bring things ahead in your garden, what you might want in your garden is a garden frame. So the garden frame is this box with the sloping top and the window sash on it. It becomes a hotbed when it has bottom heat, as it does here. What is here providing the bottom heat is a pile of horse manure and straw. The fresh horse manure will begin to break down, and as it does, it will generate a lot of heat. If you've ever had a horse, as I have, you know that manure piles will steam up in the wintertime and melt the snow. And it didn't take people any time to recognize how useful that could be if you were in a cold area and you wanted to forward things. So you build this mound a little bit larger than the dimension of your garden frame, set the frame on top of it, fill the frame up with some soil. You don't want your plants in immediately contact with that manure. And then you need a Fahrenheit thermometer because you can't plant right away. That manure is going to get so hot it can raise the temperature of the soil inside there to over 100 degrees, which would be too hot for any seed. And so the progressive gardener would let that they would make that bed early, late February, early March, let the temperature rise, and then when the temperature began to fall after the decomposition was starting to slow down, and when it dropped down to about 80 degrees, 90 or 80 degrees, then that would be a good time to begin to sow seeds in there. And the seeds would grow on in a declining temperature, which is exactly what modern greenhouse growers do when they plant seeds. You get stronger seedlings if they begin to mature with the temperatures getting cooler. They don't get as wimpy. And so this was a great way to forward crops in the spring of the year. We use these at Old Sturbridge Village. Here you see our garden frames at the minister's home with crops growing in them. We also use them in flower gardens. Another way to make the frame, the garden frame, and not have it look quite so unsightly is, instead of having your pile of horse manure above ground, is you dig a pit and fill it with the fresh horse manure and then set the frame over that, put the soil in, and then the manure is out of sight below ground, and you just have the relatively handsome looking garden frame.
You couldn't just use the top of the glass's heat alone?
That's a good question. When you do that, you're doing something different. Yes, you could do that, and it's called
I would know where to get fertilizer, but not fresh horse manure. They'd look at me like, "What's wrong with him?"
Well, you could explain the science to them. The difference is the frame all by itself with just the sash on top is called a cold frame. A cold frame. And the problem is, if you want to start tomato plants, you can't do it in a cold frame, because the cold frame will warm up well in the day and it will stay warmer than the rest of the environment at night, but not warm enough for a tomato, because the only thing that heats it is that sun coming in. And once the sun is gone, the temperature in the cold frame begins to drop dangerously. Won't bother things like cabbages. You can start cabbages ahead of time in a cold frame, broccoli, lettuce, things that like cool weather and aren't bothered by frost. But you need a hotbed. You need that bottom heat for things like eggplants and tomatoes and peppers. So good question. So then, to wind us up, at the end of the garden season, one of the things we want to be sure to do is save some seeds. And even though people could buy seeds from the various different sources I mentioned, and I've brought with me, you can take a look if you wish after the talk, I brought with me a reproduction, a copy of a shaker seed box. Seeds were not only available through the mail and down in Boston, but the shakers in communities like Shirley, Massachusetts, not very far from here, they were in the seed business. And what they did was they raised seeds, they printed the papers to put the seeds into, they packaged them, and then they would put them a good selection of seeds into boxes like this, load them onto wagons, and then go from town to town visiting country stores. And they would drop the box off with the country storekeeper, just like today, the rack that you see in the store where you go to select your seeds. The shakers were the ones that pioneered that method of business. They would come back periodically to the store to replenish any seed that needed to be stocked up on before the growing season began. And then, of course, the storekeeper got a certain commission for the sale, and the shaker seed salesman got it. But this is a reproduction, a copy of an original shaker seed box of the type they took around from country store to country store. And I've got some copies of some of the original seed packets in there that you can take a look at too. But saving your own seed was a way to save money, just as it is today, and also to keep varieties that you might have growing in your garden that are your favorites, that you wanted to be sure in case the seedsman decided to drop it the coming year. So when it came to those biennial vegetables, parsnips and the carrots and the beets and the onions that we talked about, what you would need to do is to take a certain number of those and not eat them and put them back into your garden, to take the parsnip roots and simply plant them out of your cellar back into the garden to begin growing in their second season. And the plant will look very different in its second season than it did in its first. The food value in that root will be used to build this tall plant that will be covered with flowers and then eventually with seeds. The same thing, the carrot, when it goes to seed, will look just like your wild Queen Anne's lace. It's very close cousin. We grow them plants to seed in our gardens at Old Sturbridge Village all the time, and when people come by and see our carrots going to seed, they want to know why we're growing Queen Anne's lace in our vegetable garden. Other annual vegetables, things like lettuces, for example, and beans are really easy because the part that you're going to plant is the part you dry and save for making baked beans. So all you have to do with those is just set aside a certain portion of your harvest and you've got your seed for the coming year. But saving your own seed was a very common practice. Here is some beet seed that's been harvested and being put up in some paper envelopes to set it aside for planting the coming year. So the advice from Thomas Bridgman to you gardeners as you begin your season this year is to keep a garden journal. Previous to entering on the work of the gardener should lay down rules for his future government. In order to do this, he should provide himself with a blank book in which he should first lay out a plan of his garden, allotting a place for all the different kinds of vegetables he intends to cultivate. As he proceeds in the business of planting his grounds, if he should keep an account of everything he does relative to his garden, he would soon obtain some knowledge of the art. This the writer has done for more than 20 years, and he flatters himself that a publication of the results of his practice will be interesting and useful to his readers. And I can say from experience that a garden journal is a real valuable tool. So in closing, I'd like to invite you to come visit us at the gardens at Old Sturbridge Village this year. Things will be getting underway as soon as the ground can be worked, which is a 19th century expression, and we'll be putting things in the ground, and then we celebrate with a number of garden events throughout the season, including wrapping up with that agricultural fair in the fall where we exhibit from our gardens and we invite home gardeners to bring in their heirlooms to exhibit. And also stop and visit our herb garden collection at Old Sturbridge Village, where we have over 300 different varieties of herbs which were grown and cultivated and used by people in the 19th century. And again, thank you so much for inviting me to come back.